Welcome back to Intuition on Tap, the podcast where science meets soul and where we explore intuition, nervous system regulation, emotional well-being, spirituality, and what it actually means to live life as a sensitive human in a very overstimulated world. I'm Heidi, and today we're talking about something that I think has become increasingly obvious online over the last few years. And that is that the label of empath has changed. Or maybe more accurately, the way people use the empath label has changed. A few years ago, the word empath was everywhere. Books, courses, TikToks, Instagram bios, relationship content, spiritual communities, and for many people, especially highly sensitive people, the term felt deeply validating. Finally, there was a language for experiences that they had struggled to explain for years. The emotional overwhelm, the absorption, the exhaustion in crowded places, the heightened awareness of tension and moods and energy shifts and emotional undercurrents. But somewhere along the way, the empath conversation started getting, strange. It became overinflated, commercialized, performative, and sometimes even narcissistic. And now we're seeing a backlash. People rolling their eyes at the word empath, avoiding the term entirely, mocking empath culture online. So, what happened? Did sensitivity suddenly stop being real? Well, obviously no. Highly sensitive nervous systems are absolutely real, and I am a card-carrying member. Emotional absorption is real. Empathy is real. But I think what changed is that the empath label slowly shifted from a description of experience and more into an identity that people could wear. And then from the identity into maybe what could be termed like a kind of moral positioning. And eventually manipulative personalities learned how to wear that label too. So today we're unpacking why the empath term originally helped people, why it resonated so deeply, how online culture distorted it, why narcissistic personalities love to adopt the label, and the overlap between trauma and empath experiences. We're also going to discuss the difference between empaths and the highly sensitive person or people frameworks and what perhaps a more grounded future for empath work might actually look like. And honestly, I think this conversation matters so very much because sensitivity itself is not the problem, but identity inflation around sensitivity can become incredibly unhealthy. So, let's get into it. Firstly, let's start off looking at why the empath label helped people. Because I think before we can critique the empath label honestly, we have to acknowledge why it became so meaningful in the first place. And simply put, it's because for many people, the term empath was genuinely relieving, especially before nervous system conversations kind of became mainstream. And before people were openly discussing sensory processing, sensitivity, hyper-vigilance, trauma responses, emotional dysregulation, nervous system overload. Well, many sensitive people simply thought that something was wrong with them. And that was my experience. And I can remember having this massive relief when I understood what the term empath was. That was many years ago, I will admit, but I still remember it to this day because it feels, before that term was relevant and we could identify it with it, highly sensitive people felt too emotional, too intense, too affected, too reactive, too sensitive. And the empath framework gave us and them a language for experiences that we'd never been able to explain properly. So suddenly there was a way to describe the experience of emotional absorption and overstimulation and intuitive pattern recognition, the energetic exhaustion, the emotional overwhelm, and the deep, deep emotional processing. For many people, and especially women, it was the first time that perhaps they felt understood. And honestly, I think that matters just so much because psychologically, language creates relief. And if you can name an experience, you can begin organizing around it. And many people who identified as empaths were actually discovering nervous system sensitivity for the first time. They were recognizing patterns like feeling emotionally flooded in conflict and not being able to manage themselves. Honestly, if I had $1 for every time my parents told me to stop crying as a child, I would be a millionaire. They needed recovery time after social interaction, absorbing tension in environments, heightened awareness of other people's emotional states, and difficulty separating our feelings from other people's feelings. Now, are all of these experiences mystical? Not necessarily. Many are deeply, deeply connected to the nervous system responsiveness, environmental sensitivity, pattern recognition, and survival adaptation. I speak about this in my book, and there has been plenty of research that has been done on this. But especially for people, this is so important for people who grow up in emotionally unpredictable environments. Because hyper-vigilant children often become highly perceptive adults. They, in a way, are forced to learn to read micro-expressions, tone changes, energy shifts, behavioral patterns, emotional undercurrents, not because they're magical, but because their nervous system learned that noticing subtle changes increase safety. And honestly, a lot of empath experiences exist at the intersection of sensitivity, psychology, trauma adaptation, intuition, and nervous system awareness. It's like you can't unpick any of those things and have them stand alone. So the problem is not that these experiences are fake. The problem is actually what happened next online, when empath became an identity. There was actually an opinion piece published by Mamma Mia titled, "If you say these 3 words, I already know we're not going to get along." And so, of course, I opened it up out of curiosity. And would you guess that those 3 words were, "I'm an empath"? Now, honestly, when I first saw that, I had 2 reactions. Part of me understood exactly why that article resonated with people online because, we know that the empath label has become associated in some spaces with spiritual superiority and performance, chronic victimhood, poor boundaries, emotional self-importance, or actually people who weaponize sensitivity instead of regulating it. I get it. I understand it. And I've also observed that myself. But another part of me also felt sad and actually kind of angry about it. Because underneath the eye rolling and the online backlash are many genuinely sensitive people who originally used that label because they were trying to understand their own experiences that they never had language for before. And I think this perfectly captures the identity crisis around the empath conversation right now. The backlash is not really against sensitivity itself. It's against what online culture turned the empath identity into. Because somewhere along the line, I'm an empath stopped meaning I experience heightened emotional and energetic sensitivity. And I often feel overwhelmed and overloaded, and I don't know how to manage that. And started meaning very different things depending on who was saying it. For some people, it became a way to explain nervous system overwhelm, and for others, it became a personality brand. And for some, unfortunately, it became a shield against accountability or even a shortcut to moral authority. That's a very important distinction because empathy and being an empath itself is healthy and okay and acceptable. But identity inflation and conflation around empathy can become incredibly distorted. At some point, empath stopped being something a person experienced and became something a person was. And that subtle shift kind of changed everything. Because once a label becomes identity-based, it often starts attaching itself to ego. Being identity-based in and of itself there's nothing wrong with that, and it can actually be really relieving and helpful, as I've mentioned. But when the ego gets involved, that's where it becomes problematic. Because then the online culture amplified it further. The message became, empaths are different, empaths are spiritually gifted, empaths are targeted because they shine so brightly. Empaths are too pure for this world. Empaths love deeper than everyone else. Empaths are always victims of narcissists. And this is where things started becoming very psychologically messy. Because sensitivity does not automatically equal emotional maturity, self-awareness, kindness, regulation, or healthy behavior. And someone can be highly sensitive and still manipulate, still avoid accountability, emotionally dump on other people. They can play victim, have terrible boundaries, and in fact behave narcissistically. And that's really important. Because empathy is not the same thing as emotional health, or being an empath does not necessarily mean that you're emotionally healthy either. And honestly, I think online empath culture sometimes accidentally created almost like a moral hierarchy around sensitivity, as though being emotionally, energetically, physically, and spiritually affected automatically made someone more evolved. But heightened sensitivity alone is not wisdom. And without regulation, it can become a hot mess. And that can include reactivity, hyper-vigilance, projection, emotional fusion, and identity attachment. It can also become codependence and other really unhealthy, unregulated expressions of this heightened sensitivity. And I think some people also became deeply attached to the empath label because it explained pain in a way that also felt special. So that's the nuance. The label did not just provide understanding, it also provided identity. And sometimes identity can become, I guess, addictive, especially if someone has spent their whole life feeling unseen, misunderstood, or emotionally unsafe. If the person has felt intrinsically different to those around them and have been repeatedly told to stop being too much and stop feeling too much, or in other words, they are told to be less of themselves to make others feel more comfortable around them. Now, again, I want to be very clear. This does not mean empaths are fake. Absolutely not. Far from it. I am an empath myself, as I've mentioned. But it does mean that online culture transformed a legitimate sensitivity framework into something that has become increasingly performative. And once something becomes socially powerful online, other personalities begin adopting it too. Which brings us to the next part of this conversation. Or why narcissistic personalities adopted the empath label. So this is probably the most uncomfortable part of the conversation, but I think it absolutely needs to be discussed honestly. Because narcissistic personalities are often drawn towards identities that create specialness, admiration, moral superiority, or emotional authority. And eventually, the empath label started offering all four. Think about it. If society begins framing empaths as uniquely gifted, spiritually advanced, emotionally superior, endlessly victimized, misunderstood geniuses of emotion, then manipulative personalities will eventually learn how to wear that costume. That's just the psychological reality. Why do they do it? Well, they do it to manipulate others and to get their needs met in the distorted fashion. And honestly, I think this is one reason the empath label lost credibility online, because eventually people started noticing that some of the loudest empaths, so-called, online displayed kind of grandiosity and superiority and that were very ego-driven, emotional manipulation, perhaps the chronic victim identity, and more importantly, lack of accountability, emotional entitlement, and the one that I hate the most, performative spirituality. So everything kind of became my energy, my frequency, my intuition, my sensitivity. And sometimes what was actually happening was poor boundaries, projection, emotional dysregulation, and untreated trauma. So now, to be clear, not every person, obviously, identifying as an empath is narcissistic, not even remotely. And I know that I have to say that, but it kind of comes without having to say it. Narcissistic personalities are often extremely skilled at adopting identities that create emotional leverage. And the empath label became socially useful for manipulation because it could also instantly position someone as the victim, or the wise one, or the emotionally gifted one, or the misunderstood one. What I want you to think about now is when narcissists go to therapy because their partner has asked them to or demanded that they do. And the narcissist actually, for them, it becomes like a training experience. So they then mimic the type of language and the body language that the therapist is saying or projecting. And then they mimic that in their real lives in order to manipulate people, not because they've learned something about themselves or about trauma or about therapy. It's specifically so they can use that information and wield it and weaponize it. So think about it in that context as well. Because they're using this label fundamentally to avoid accountability. And this can include statements like, oh, I'm just an empath, or I can't help it, I absorb everyone's energy. Or like, you're triggering my nervous system. My intuition says you're too toxic or low vibe. And while sometimes those statements may contain some level of truth, they can also become shields against self-reflection, particularly for narcissistic personalities. And this is where I believe the conversation became distorted online, because eventually empath stopped describing high sensitivity and started functioning more like a personality brand. And honestly, that's when the backlash started. So, empath versus highly sensitive person. Let's look at this. This is why I think many people have started gravitating more toward the highly sensitive person framework instead. And look, Honestly, it's been around for years. The first book that I wrote on empaths and highly sensitive people was literally in 2016, so 10 years ago. And the research existed far before that. And I think that people like to use the term highly sensitive person because it tends to feel, for some people, and after all of the backlash online, more grounded and perhaps less spiritually inflated and less morally loaded, more nervous system based. The highly sensitive person framework looks at sensory processing sensitivity, or SPS, emotional depth, overstimulation, environmental responsiveness, and also nervous system reactivity. And psychologically, I think that can perhaps be healthier because it removes some of that identity hierarchy. You know, with this I'm so spiritually gifted kind of people. And it says that this is a particular way that my brain functions aligned with a distinct nervous system pattern, not this makes you spiritually superior. And honestly, I think that distinction matters enormously because once sensitivity becomes tied to identity superiority, people stop questioning themselves properly. And then everything becomes externalized and everyone else becomes toxic, narcissistic, low vibe, or unsafe. And while emotionally unsafe people absolutely exist, and they can definitely be attracted to highly sensitive people, absolutely, not every uncomfortable interaction is abuse. Sometimes people are just human, and sometimes conflict is mutual. And honestly, sometimes sensitivity itself amplifies emotional experiences because highly sensitive people experience emotional flooding, and it can be really hard to control their feelings, particularly if they are dysregulated. And I think the highly sensitive person framework helps create maybe more of a responsibility around that. Now, personally, I still understand why people emotionally connect with the empath label, including myself, because some experiences genuinely do feel deeper than traditional psychology language captures. And specifically and especially around concepts like intuition and energy awareness, pattern recognition, emotional absorption, and nervous system sensitivity. So, look, I'm not necessarily interested in completely throwing the empath label away, but I think there has to be some reclamation that takes place because I think the conversation needs refinement because the problem was never sensitivity. The problem was identity inflation. Let's now look at the future of empath work, or where do we go from here? Honestly, I don't think the answer is throwing the empath label away entirely, nor do I think the answer is pretending the conversation hasn't become distorted in some corners of the internet. I think the answer is maturity. One of the things I want to make clear is that there's nothing inherently wrong with identifying as an empath. As I've said, I do. But human beings, we naturally organize ourselves around identities. We identify as parents, leaders, creatives, introverts, entrepreneurs, healers, athletes, wives, husbands, and countless other things throughout our lives. Identity helps us make sense of ourselves and of our experiences. It gives us language to things that might otherwise feel confusing or isolating. The problem is not the identity itself. The problem begins when any identity becomes a shield against self-awareness, self-responsibility, or accountability. When an identity stops being a description and starts becoming, like a defense mechanism, well, then growth tends to stall or stop completely. And this is where I think some of the empath conversation became unhelpful. Not because sensitivity isn't real, Not because emotional absorption isn't real, and not because people don't genuinely have experiences that resonate with the empath label, but because in some spaces the label became the explanation for everything. Every difficult interaction became proof of being surrounded by toxic people. Every uncomfortable emotion became someone else's energy. Every challenge became externalized rather than explored. And that's where discernment gets lost. It's also worth acknowledging, I think, that part of the backlash we're seeing today comes from the fact that the empath label was, in some ways, hijacked. What began as a way for sensitive people to understand their experience was gradually adopted by people who used it very differently. In some cases, it became a vehicle for superiority, victimhood, manipulation, or avoiding accountability altogether. In others, it became like a marketing tool designed to sell specialness rather than self-awareness. And when any identity is repeatedly misused, people eventually stop trusting it. But I don't believe, like I've said, the answer is abandoning the term entirely. I think the answer is about reclaiming it. Reclaiming it from those who have weaponized it, reclaiming it from those who used it to excuse unhealthy behavior, reclaiming it from those who turned sensitivity into some form of status. Because it's at its healthiest, the empath identity was never about being special. It was about understanding a particular way of moving and moving through the world and experiencing the world. It was about recognizing that heightened sensitivity comes with unique challenges, unique responsibilities, and unique strengths. And perhaps the next evolution of empath work is not defending the label or discarding it, but redefining it, not as a badge of superiority and not as a proof of victimhood, but as a commitment to self-awareness, regulation, discernment, healthy boundaries, and emotional responsibility. In other words, taking back what was always valuable about the term and leaving behind everything that distorted it. And interestingly, when a community begins reclaiming an identity in a healthier way, something else tends to happen naturally. The people who were drawn to the label primarily for attention, status, specialness, or social media validation, or to sell courses, often become less relevant. Not because they're pushed out, attacked, or exposed, but because the audience itself evolves. And as people become more discerning, they stop looking for those who make them feel special and start looking for those who help them become skillful. They become less interested in performance and more interested in practical transformation, less interested in grand woo-woo claims, and I guess more interested in grounded wisdom. And when that happens, much of the noise begins to fade on its own. Because healthy identities tend to attract healthy conversations. The future of empath work won't be built on who can appear the most gifted, the most wounded, or the most spiritually advanced. It will be built on who can help sensitive people navigate life with greater self-awareness, resilience, discernment, and better self-trust. And I think that's ultimately good news for everyone who genuinely cares about this work and the people who do identify as an empath. For me, the future of empath work is much less about rigid identity. And like I said, much more about skill. It's about learning how to stay connected to yourself in environments that feel overwhelming. It's about understanding the difference between intuition and fear, the difference between emotional absorption and emotional responsibility, the difference between nervous system activation and genuine inner knowing and trusting that inner knowing. It's about recognizing that being highly sensitive is not a spiritual hierarchy, nor is it a flaw. It's simply a way of experiencing the world that comes with both gifts and challenges. And like any trait, it benefits from understanding, practice, and self-awareness. I think the conversation is gradually moving in a healthier direction, away from performance and towards embodiment, away from emotional grandiosity and towards more emotional maturity, and away from identity as the destination and towards identity as a starting point for deeper self-understanding. Because sensitivity itself is never the problem. The goal was never to become less sensitive. The goal was always to become more skillful with that sensitivity. And when that happens, the label matters far less than the lived experience behind it. If today's episode resonated with you, I want you to remember this. The empath label originally helped many people feel seen, heard, acknowledged. And that matters a lot. But online culture eventually transforms sensitivity into identity, performance, and sometimes even emotional or spiritual hierarchy. And perhaps the future of empath work is not abandoning the conversation entirely, but moving and continuing to refine it. Moving from identity to understanding, performance to embodiment, overwhelm to regulation, and victimhood to responsibility. And I think maybe one of the most important things, emotional chaos to discernment. Because sensitivity is not the problem, but without grounding, almost any identity can become distorted online. If this episode supported you today, please do make sure you subscribe to Intuition on Tap on YouTube or your favorite podcast platform, including Apple and Spotify. And if you're looking for grounded support around nervous system regulation, intuition, emotional well-being, and empath self-mastery, you can explore empath supportive courses and resources through intuitionco.com. And if you aren't watching or listening to this via YouTube, make sure you head on over to my YouTube channel, where you will find all kinds of free videos, hypnosis, other resources to support you. It's Intuition Co. And remember, you don't need to be special to deserve support. You simply need to understand your nervous system well enough to stop abandoning yourself inside of it. Remember, regulation first, intuition follows. And I will see you in the next episode.